I've taken down marks before. Cheaters, frauds, thieves. You name it. I'd made it my specialty to eliminate those who think betrayal has no consequence. But never did I expect to find myself in their crosshairs, blindsided in the most personal way imaginable. Evelyn was my everything. I thought we were partners, a team. For someone like me, who walked on the edge, having her as my anchor was the only thing that made me feel human. But that illusion shattered the moment I saw her stepping into the hotel room with him. It started as another job. Some rich executive wanted dirt on his wife, who he suspected was unfaithful. Surveillance was straightforward. Hotel check-ins, blurry camera footage of cozy dinners, whispers over drinks. All routine. I'd been tailing the guy for weeks, mapping his patterns. That evening, the scene played out like clockwork. His sleek car pulled into the lot, valet handed him the keys, and he headed straight for the room. But this time, a woman joined him, one I recognized far too well. It was Evelyn. For a moment, my body froze. It wasn't disbelief. I've seen enough to know what people are capable of. No, it was the certainty, the gut-wrenching confirmation that the life I thought was mine had been a lie. I followed protocol, keeping a distance, camera steady. Every click of the shutter felt like betrayal punching me in the gut. Her laughter through the thin walls cut sharper than any weapon I've handled. My mind raced through every moment we'd shared, every kiss, every promise. Were those lies too? Or did they simply not matter anymore? I finished the job that night, submitting the evidence, pretending none of it mattered. The client was thrilled, completely oblivious to the storm brewing in my head. But for me, everything had changed. Evelyn wasn't just unfaithful. She was with the very man I'd been hired to destroy. The irony wasn't lost on me. When I got home that night, she was there, as if nothing had happened. She smiled at me like I was her whole world, asked about my day, even leaned in for a kiss. I couldn't bring myself to look at her. How long had she been living this double life? And worse, how had I missed it? I had no answers, only questions and a growing pit in my stomach. But I knew one thing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The days that followed were a test of endurance, a battle between maintaining composure and the turmoil seething beneath my skin. I had spent years perfecting the art of detachment, mastering the ability to act without emotion, to execute plans without hesitation. But this was different. This was personal, an invasion not just of my life, but of my identity. Evelyn's presence became suffocating. Every glance, every touch, every word she spoke felt like acid on my resolve. She moved through our home as if everything was normal, like she hadn't just torn the foundation of my trust into jagged pieces. I watched her closely, every interaction, every casual moment, studying her as if she were a target. The way she smiled at me, cooked my meals, slipped into bed beside me, it all felt rehearsed, hollow. It was as though she'd become a stranger overnight. I replayed the scene at the hotel in my mind endlessly. Her hand on his arm, her laugh so carefree, the way she looked at him with a spark of something I hadn't seen in years. It was a haunting reel of betrayal that wouldn't stop, no matter how hard I tried to block it out. I found myself questioning everything. When had it started? Was this the first time? Or had there been others I didn't know about? The uncertainty was maddening. Work became my escape. I buried myself in contracts, accepting any job that came my way just to keep my mind occupied. The precision of my assignments, the meticulous planning, the long hours of surveillance, the calculated execution, gave me a sense of control I desperately needed. But no matter how focused I tried to remain, Evelyn's shadow followed me everywhere. She had become an unshakable presence, even in her absence. At night, sleep was a luxury I could no longer afford. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying our life together. Memories that once brought comfort now felt like cruel reminders of my naivety. Her laughter, the warmth of her embrace, the promises we had made, they all felt like part of some elaborate act. I began dissecting every moment, searching for signs I might have missed. Was there hesitation in her voice when she said she loved me? Did she glance at her phone too often when I wasn't looking? The questions were endless, the answers elusive. I started following her. It wasn't out of professional curiosity. It was personal. I needed to know the extent of her betrayal, to see if she would betray me again while looking me in the eye and pretending everything was fine. Her routine was maddeningly ordinary. She went to work, met friends for lunch, ran errands. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more beneath the surface, something hidden just beyond my reach. Then came the day she slipped up. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. She claimed she was meeting an old friend for coffee, a name I didn't recognize but didn't question. I followed her from a distance, my car blending into the busy streets. She drove to a part of town we rarely visited, parked outside a small cafe, and walked in with her usual grace. I waited, watching through the tinted windows of my car, feeling a familiar sense of detachment creeping in. This was work now, a mission. After half an hour, she emerged. But she wasn't alone. The man from the hotel was with her, his hand casually brushing against hers as they laughed together. She leaned into him, her body language unmistakable. It was the confirmation I didn't want but had expected. My stomach churned as I captured the moment with my camera, framing it perfectly as if it were just another assignment. I watched them part ways, her returning to her car as though nothing had happened. She didn't glance around, didn't hesitate. Her confidence was unsettling, as if she were untouchable. I followed her back home, keeping a safe distance, and arrived minutes after she did. She greeted me at the door, her face lighting up as though she hadn't just spent the afternoon with another man. It was almost impressive, the ease with which she carried on the facade. That night, I sat alone in my office, the photograph spread out in front of me like evidence at a trial. Her betrayal was undeniable, stark and unrelenting in black and white. But as I stared at the images, a new question began to take shape. It wasn't just about what she had done or why. It was about what I was going to do next. Evelyn had played her hand. Now it was my move. The weight of my discovery settled into my bones, becoming a constant presence in everything I did. Days stretched into weeks, each one more grueling than the last as I maintained the charade of normalcy. Evelyn's betrayal was a wound I couldn't let heal, not yet. Not until I understood every piece of her deceit. She had grown bold. Maybe she thought I would never suspect her. Perhaps my long absences, the secrecy of my work, had made her think I was too distracted to notice. But now I saw everything. Her subtle shifts in demeanor, the way she lingered on her phone after dinner, her sudden insistence on running errands alone. Every movement of hers became a clue, a thread to unravel. It wasn't just about catching her in the act. I needed to know who she truly was, the depths of her lies. What kind of woman could smile at her husband, share his bed, while her heart, or at least her body, belonged to someone else? The question gnawed at me. And so I watched her, tracked her, observed her life with the same precision I'd employed to dismantle so many others. Her meetings with the man became more frequent, though she was careful never to let them linger too long or appear too intimate in public. He was cautious too. He must have known she was married, likely aware of me, though he probably had no idea of the kind of man he was dealing with. They were discreet but not infallible. Mistakes piled up, a text she left open for a second too long, receipts from a cafe across town, a strand of long blonde hair I found on her coat that wasn't hers. Each piece of evidence built a clearer picture. She wasn't just unfaithful, she was methodical, deliberate. She had been living this double life for months, if not years. And yet, she came home every evening and played the part of the devoted wife. It was a performance, one I now saw through completely. The worst part wasn't her betrayal. It was the lie of it all, the way she pretended to be someone she wasn't. I could almost understand a fleeting mistake, a lapse in judgment, but this was something else. Evelyn had woven an intricate web of deceit, trapping me in it while she danced just beyond my reach. I began piecing together her movements, tracing her steps as if I were preparing for an operation. I hacked into her phone, combed through her emails and messages, and even bugged her car. The picture that emerged was more damning than I could have imagined. She wasn't just seeing this man, she was confiding in him, sharing things she had never shared with me. There were messages about her frustrations, her loneliness, how she felt like I had become distant and cold. At first, her words stung. They were like knives twisting in my gut, and I hated her for every one of them. But as I read more, my anger shifted. She blamed me for everything, her unhappiness, her choices, even her betrayal. She painted herself as the victim, a woman driven to infidelity because her husband had neglected her. It was a cruel twist of logic, one that let her off the hook while making me the villain of her story. I couldn't tell if she believed her own lies or if they were just another layer of her manipulation. Either way, it didn't matter. The facts were clear. She had betrayed me, and she felt no remorse. If anything, she seemed to justify her actions, as though they were some kind of escape from a life she no longer wanted. The man she was seeing became an obsession for me. His name was Thomas, a corporate consultant with a flashy car and a smile that probably charmed everyone in the room. He was the kind of man I despised, polished, superficial, and entirely self-serving. He lived in a sleek apartment downtown, the kind of place Evelyn had always dreamed of. I began watching him too, learning his habits, his routines. He was as predictable as they came. Early morning gym sessions, long lunches at expensive restaurants, and evenings spent charming his way into someone else's life. But I wasn't just gathering information. I was planning. My entire career had been built on the premise that actions had consequences, that betrayal came at a price. Evelyn and Thomas had crossed a line, and it was only a matter of time before they faced the fallout. I started small, testing the waters. An anonymous call to Thomas's office exposed a minor indiscretion in his financial records, something that would tie him up in corporate red tape for weeks. I sent Evelyn a bouquet of lilies, her least favorite flower, along with a note that read, "To new beginnings." She dismissed it as a wrong delivery, but I saw the flicker of unease in her eyes. It was a slow unraveling, subtle and precise, just enough to shake their confidence without giving away my hand. I wasn't ready for the final move yet. First, I needed to make sure they understood the weight of what they had done. They had taken everything from me, my trust, my peace, my future, and now I would take it back piece by piece. But the question lingered: how far was I willing to go? Would I walk away, leave them to their misery, and start over? Or would I finish what they had started and ensure they paid the full price for their betrayal? For now, I kept my emotions in check, my actions deliberate. Revenge, like any good plan, required patience. And I had plenty of that. The more I watched Evelyn and Thomas, the more their world began to unravel. Slowly at first, like a thread tugged loose from an expensive suit. My patience became my weapon, each action calculated to pull them closer to the edge without revealing my hand. Evelyn was oblivious. She had always been confident in her ability to control situations, to keep her secrets buried. But she underestimated me. She didn't see the small cracks forming in her carefully crafted life. I saw them, though. I widened them. It started with the smallest inconvenience: her phone mysteriously glitching during one of her work dinners. It left her unable to respond to Thomas's messages for hours, sparking tension between them. She came home that night tense, her face a mask of frustration. I pretended not to notice, simply asking if everything was okay. She waved it off, but I could see the strain in her forced smile. Thomas was no better. His routine, which once ran like clockwork, became disrupted. His gym membership was suddenly revoked over a payment error that never existed. His car, always parked in the same pristine space at his high-rise, was keyed, a jagged scratch running the length of its gleaming black paint. He filed a complaint with building security, but nothing came of it. I'd made sure of that. Meanwhile, I focused on gathering more information, delving deeper into Thomas's life. He had his own secrets, of course. Men like him always did. There were discrepancies in his financial records, a string of questionable transactions that painted a picture of someone who liked to blur ethical lines for personal gain. A few anonymous tips to the right people ensured that his company took notice. It wasn't enough to destroy him outright, yet. Just enough to make his world feel less certain. Evelyn began to unravel under the weight of it all. She didn't know where the pressure was coming from, only that it was there, relentless and unyielding. She started making mistakes. Her lies became sloppier, her excuses more transparent. She claimed to be working late one evening, but I'd already seen her calendar and knew there was no such meeting. She didn't expect me to check. She was losing control. I watched as the strain began to show in our home life. Evelyn, who had always prided herself on her composure, became snappish and irritable. She lashed out over trivial things, the laundry left unfolded, the dinner slightly overcooked. I let her. Every argument, every raised voice, was another thread pulling her closer to the truth. She was no longer the poised, confident woman I once knew. She was cracking, and she didn't even realize why. Despite her fraying exterior, she still tried to maintain the illusion of normalcy. She threw herself into planning a weekend trip, insisting it was something we both needed. I played along, feigning enthusiasm while making my own plans in secret. The trip would be the perfect opportunity to push her further, to see how far she could fall. We drove out to a cabin in the woods, a place we had visited in the early days of our marriage. The irony wasn't lost on me. This was where we had once built memories of a life filled with promise, and now it would serve as the backdrop for her undoing. Evelyn spent the first day trying to recapture that lost connection, cooking elaborate meals and reminiscing about the past. I let her talk, nodding at the appropriate moments, but my thoughts were elsewhere. That evening, as she slept soundly beside me, I left the cabin and made a call. The private investigator I'd hired had come through with new information, a confirmation that Thomas had been seeing another woman, someone he met at a charity event. The affair was new, just a few weeks old, but it was enough. The cracks in their perfect little world were now gaping chasms. The next morning, I casually brought up the subject of loyalty, weaving it into a conversation about some distant acquaintance of ours who had been caught in an affair. Evelyn's reaction was predictable. Defensive, dismissive. She accused me of being judgmental, said that people made mistakes and shouldn't be condemned for them. It was a poor attempt to justify herself without admitting to anything outright. I didn't press her, letting the weight of her words hang in the air. When we returned home, she seemed relieved, as if the weekend had done its job of deflecting her guilt. But I had no intention of letting her feel at ease. That night, I left a printout of Thomas's financial indiscretions on her desk, a carefully curated selection of damning evidence, paired with a simple note: "Is this the man worth risking everything for?" I watched from the shadows as she discovered it, her face blanching as she scanned the pages. She looked around the room, as if expecting to see me there, but I stayed hidden. Her breathing quickened, and she crumpled the papers in her fists before tossing them into the trash. That was the moment I knew the walls were closing in on her. Evelyn was cornered, her lies no longer safe, her perfect life crumbling beneath her. And yet, she had no idea just how far I was willing to go. The game wasn't over. Not yet. It was only just beginning. Evelyn's reaction to the evidence I left behind was exactly what I had anticipated. Fear, confusion, and then defiance. She pretended nothing had happened, carried on with her usual routines, but I saw the subtle changes. Her movements became more cautious, her demeanor tense. The certainty she had carried for so long was slipping through her fingers, and she was grasping at straws to hold it together. I let her squirm. There was no rush. Watching her unravel was part of the plan. She thought she could bury the papers I left, but I'd already anticipated that. The crumpled remnants were still in the trash when I fished them out later that night. I smoothed them out, returned them to her desk, and left another note: "You can't ignore this forever." The following morning, she was quieter than usual. She avoided me, burying herself in chores that didn't need doing and inventing errands that gave her an excuse to leave the house. It was laughable, her attempt to regain some semblance of control. But I didn't confront her. Not yet. I needed her paranoia to grow, to fester, until it consumed her. Thomas wasn't doing much better. The fallout from the anonymous tips I'd sent to his company was escalating. His bosses were beginning to scrutinize his work, questioning every decision, every deal. I'd planted just enough seeds to make them doubt him, to turn his confidence into uncertainty. And then there was the matter of his new affair. I'd been watching her too, the younger woman who had unwittingly become another pawn in my game. She was the kind of woman Thomas couldn't resist. Ambitious, charming, just naive enough to fall for his polished exterior. Their relationship was still in its early stages, but I knew it wouldn't take long for Evelyn to notice. She was too perceptive to miss the signs, especially when she was already on edge. To speed things along, I made sure Evelyn stumbled across a clue. A receipt for a dinner at an upscale restaurant, the same one she and Thomas had frequented, accidentally appeared in her car. The date on the receipt coincided with one of the nights he had claimed to be working late. It wasn't difficult to imagine her mind filling in the blanks, connecting the dots I had laid out for her. Her reaction was predictable. That evening, she sat on the couch, staring blankly at the television, the receipt folded neatly in her lap. She didn't say a word, but her knuckles were white, her breathing shallow. She was spiraling, and it was only a matter of time before she confronted him. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered the hotel room, the laughter, the lies. This wasn't just about punishment. It was about justice, about making her understand the weight of her betrayal. A few days later, I followed her to one of their usual meeting spots, a secluded park on the outskirts of town. She was waiting for him, her expression tight, her body language defensive. When Thomas arrived, I stayed hidden, watching from a distance as their confrontation unfolded. She showed him the receipt, her voice rising with every word, though I couldn't make out what she was saying. Thomas tried to placate her, his hands raised in a gesture of innocence, but it was clear she wasn't buying it. The argument escalated quickly. Evelyn's voice grew louder, her gestures more frantic. Thomas, ever the charmer, attempted to calm her down, but she shoved him away, her frustration spilling over into anger. Finally, he snapped, his mask slipping for a brief moment as he barked something sharp and dismissive. Evelyn recoiled, stunned by the sudden shift in his demeanor. It was a crack, a small but significant break in their relationship. I could see it in her face, the dawning realization that perhaps she wasn't as important to him as she had believed. It was the first time she had seen him without his carefully crafted veneer, and the disillusionment was written all over her. I left before they parted ways, satisfied that the seed of doubt had been firmly planted. Evelyn returned home that night, her face pale, her movements subdued. She avoided me entirely, retreating to the bedroom without so much as a word. When I checked her phone later, I found her messages to Thomas. Short, clipped, filled with questions he didn't seem eager to answer. The balance of power was shifting. Evelyn's world was collapsing, and Thomas was no longer her sanctuary. I had taken everything she thought she could rely on, everything she believed was safe, and turned it against her. But this was only the beginning. There were still moves to make, still pieces to position before the final play. For now, I waited, patient and methodical, as the cracks in her life widened into chasms. The tension in the house grew heavier with each passing day. A silent war waged in the small, unspoken moments. Evelyn was unraveling, but she was trying to hide it, pretending that everything was fine, that her carefully curated world wasn't crumbling under the weight of its own deceit. It was almost admirable, her stubborn insistence on keeping the mask in place. But I knew it wouldn't last. She started avoiding her usual routines. The morning cups of coffee we used to share became solitary affairs as she busied herself with meaningless tasks. Her phone, once always in her hand, now sat untouched for hours. I could see the guilt eating away at her, making her second-guess every move, every decision. The strain was written across her face in the deepening lines around her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped ever so slightly. I watched, silently, letting her spiral. The truth was closing in on her, and she knew it. She just didn't know how or when it would strike. That uncertainty was my weapon, and I wielded it carefully, deliberately. Thomas, meanwhile, was floundering. The corporate investigation into his finances had intensified, and he was clearly feeling the pressure. He wasn't as sharp as he used to be, his confidence slipping in ways that were obvious even from afar. His texts to Evelyn became less frequent, shorter, lacking the charm and attention that had drawn her to him in the first place. The man who had once been the center of her secret life was now a source of frustration, a liability she hadn't anticipated. I decided it was time to push things further. Using the information I'd gathered on Thomas, I orchestrated a meeting between him and his new fling. A well-timed message sent from an anonymous number lured him to a cafe downtown, where she was conveniently waiting, oblivious to the trap I'd set. Evelyn, of course, received a different message, one that led her to the same cafe at the perfect moment. It was a masterstroke, watching the collision unfold from my vantage point across the street. Evelyn walked in, her expression shifting from confusion to fury as she spotted Thomas laughing with the other woman. She didn't make a scene, not at first. Instead, she stood frozen in the doorway, watching them, piecing together the betrayal in real time. When she finally approached their table, her voice was low but sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. Thomas tried to explain, his words tumbling over each other in a frantic attempt to regain control. But Evelyn wasn't having it. She wasn't the type to share her affections, especially not with someone who had already betrayed her trust. The argument escalated quickly, drawing stares from the other patrons. The younger woman, clearly out of her depth, excused herself and fled, leaving Thomas to face Evelyn's wrath alone. I left before the fight reached its climax. I didn't need to hear every word to know how it would end. Evelyn stormed back home later that evening, her face a mask of anger and humiliation. She slammed the door behind her, the sound reverberating through the house like a gunshot. I stayed in my office, letting her stew in her emotions. She needed to feel the weight of this, to understand the depth of her mistake. The fallout was immediate. Evelyn stopped leaving the house unless it was absolutely necessary. She didn't answer her phone, didn't respond to messages. She retreated inward, cutting herself off from the world she had once so confidently navigated. I heard her crying at night, muffled sobs that she tried to hide even in the solitude of our bedroom. But I didn't comfort her. I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I turned my attention to the final phase of my plan. It wasn't enough to make her feel the pain she had caused. It needed to be permanent, irreversible. I began compiling everything I had on her and Thomas. The photos, the messages, the receipts, the financial discrepancies. It was a damning collection, one that left no room for doubt or misinterpretation. My mind churned with the possibilities. Should I confront her directly, lay everything out on the table and force her to face the truth? Or should I let her discover it on her own, piece by agonizing piece? There was a certain satisfaction in the idea of her finding her own downfall, realizing that every step she took was leading her closer to the edge. But then there was the question of what came next. What would I do once the truth was fully exposed? Could I simply walk away, leave her to pick up the pieces of the life she had destroyed? Or would I press further, ensuring that the consequences of her actions followed her wherever she went? For now, I focused on the immediate. Evelyn's life was in freefall, her carefully constructed facade crumbling into dust. She had lost Thomas, lost the control she once wielded so confidently. All that remained was the truth, hanging over her like a storm cloud, waiting to strike. And I would be the one to bring it down. Evelyn was a shell of the woman she once was. The confidence that had once defined her was now replaced with something I couldn't quite recognize. Desperation, maybe. Fear. It clung to her like a second skin, visible in every movement, every hesitant glance she threw my way. She knew something was wrong, though I doubted she fully understood the scope of it yet. That was the most satisfying part. The waiting, the knowledge that her unraveling was inevitable. I gave her space, not out of kindness but as part of the plan. I wanted her to think, to reflect, to let her mind fill with a kind of doubts that would break her further. The tension between us was palpable. We barely spoke now, the silence thick and suffocating. She avoided my gaze, flinched at my touch, and spent hours locked away in our bedroom. It was as though she were trying to disappear into the walls of the house, to escape the consequences she could feel creeping closer. One afternoon, I returned home earlier than usual. The house was quiet, the kind of eerie silence that set my instincts on edge. I found her sitting in the living room, surrounded by photo albums and old mementos from our life together. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, but there was a calmness about her that was almost unsettling. She didn't look up as I entered, didn't acknowledge my presence. Instead, she flipped through the pages of an album, pausing every so often to trace a picture with trembling fingers. I didn't interrupt her. I didn't need to. Whatever she was searching for in those memories, she wouldn't find it. Not anymore. Over the next few days, Evelyn's behavior shifted. She became quieter, more subdued, almost meek in her interactions with me. It was a stark contrast to the woman who had once stood so boldly in the center of every room, commanding attention with her presence. Now, she seemed to be shrinking, her confidence stripped away layer by layer. She started to ask questions, subtle at first, then more direct. Had I noticed anything unusual? Was everything okay between us? Did I still love her? I answered with the same detached politeness I had perfected in my work. Of course, everything was fine. Why wouldn't it be? She didn't press further, but I could see the frustration building behind her eyes. She wanted answers, but she was too afraid to ask the right questions. She wasn't ready to face the truth. Not yet. Thomas, on the other hand, was spiraling out of control. The corporate investigation into his finances had reached a boiling point, and his reputation was in tatters. His name was circulating in the industry, whispers of misconduct and unethical practices trailing him like a shadow. His superiors had placed him on indefinite leave, and it was only a matter of time before he was forced to resign entirely. I'd also made sure his personal life was equally chaotic. The younger woman he had been seeing was now fully aware of his duplicity, thanks to another carefully timed revelation. She confronted him publicly at one of his favorite bars, her voice carrying over the din of music and chatter. The scene was messy, humiliating, exactly what I'd intended. By the time she stormed out, Thomas was left standing alone, a picture of defeat. Evelyn hadn't reached out to him since the incident at the cafe. I knew because I'd been monitoring her phone, her emails, every digital breadcrumb she might leave behind. The silence between them was deafening, a testament to the cracks I'd driven between them. But I also knew that silence wouldn't last. People like Evelyn and Thomas couldn't help themselves. They always circled back to the very things that destroyed them. I was right. Late one night, her phone buzzed with a message from him. It was short, pleading, "We need to talk." She didn't respond immediately. She stared at the screen for a long time, her thumb hovering over the keyboard, her expression unreadable. Finally, she set the phone down and walked away. But the seed had been planted. I could see the wheels turning in her mind, the old patterns of self-destruction creeping back in. The next day, she was unusually restless. She cleaned the house from top to bottom, reorganized the pantry, rearranged the furniture in the living room. It was an obvious distraction, a way to avoid confronting the decision she was wrestling with. By evening, I saw her sitting on the edge of our bed, her phone in hand. She was staring at Thomas's message again, her expression one of tortured indecision. She didn't know I was watching. I had become so adept at slipping into the background, at moving unnoticed, that even she, my wife, who should have known me better than anyone, had no idea how closely I was observing her. When she finally replied to him, her message was hesitant, guarded. "What is there to talk about?" His response came quickly, as if he had been waiting for her reply all day. "Please. Just give me a chance to explain." She agreed to meet him. I wasn't surprised. This was who she was, after all, a woman who couldn't resist the pull of a mistake, no matter how destructive. But this time, I wouldn't let her walk away unscathed. This time, I would be there, watching, ensuring that her choices led exactly where I wanted them to. The next move was hers. But the final move would be mine. Evelyn's decision to meet Thomas was the moment I'd been waiting for. It wasn't just predictable. It was inevitable. She couldn't resist the pull of closure, the allure of hearing whatever excuse or explanation he'd concocted to absolve himself. It didn't matter whether she believed him or not. What mattered was that she was willing to go, to step deeper into the web she'd spun for herself. I watched her prepare that afternoon. She took her time, carefully selecting an outfit that was just casual enough to pass as unintentional but still flattering. She straightened her hair, touched up her makeup, and studied her reflection for longer than usual. It was a performance, though I doubted she realized it. Every movement, every decision was steeped in the desire to reclaim control, to project confidence in a situation where she had none. She left just after 6 p.m., telling me she was meeting a friend for dinner. I didn't press her. I hadn't needed to for weeks. She had grown so accustomed to me pretending not to notice her lies that she no longer even hesitated. It was almost insulting, the ease with which she assumed she could deceive me. I waited 5 minutes before following her. The location was predictable. An upscale wine bar on the edge of downtown. It was the kind of place they had frequented before, though she likely hadn't considered how transparent that choice made her. I parked a safe distance away and watched as she entered, her body language tense but determined. Thomas was already there, seated at a corner table near the back. He stood as she approached, his smile too eager, too practiced. I could almost see the effort it took for Evelyn to return it, the way her lips barely curved upward, her eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. She was already regretting this, but it was too late to turn back. I stayed outside, blending into the crowd of passers-by as I waited. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a notification from the hidden microphone I had planted earlier that day beneath the table where they now sat. It was a risk, one I wouldn't have taken if I hadn't been certain she would choose this place. But my gamble had paid off. I slipped on my earbuds and listened. Their conversation was stilted at first, filled with empty pleasantries and forced smiles. Thomas started with an apology, his tone dripping with sincerity. He admitted to his mistakes, claimed he had been overwhelmed, that he hadn't meant to hurt her. Evelyn listened, her responses clipped, her voice trembling just enough to betray the anger she was trying to suppress. But then, as he always did, Thomas shifted the narrative. He turned the focus onto her, subtly planting the idea that she bore some responsibility for what had happened. He mentioned their complicated situation, their shared struggles, and how he had always felt that she understood him in a way no one else could. It was manipulation at its finest, a calculated attempt to draw her back in. For a moment, I thought it might work. Evelyn's voice softened, her anger giving way to hesitation. She began to speak, her words faltering as though she were considering his perspective. But then she stopped, her tone hardening as she accused him of betrayal, not just to her, but to everything they had built together. She didn't raise her voice, but the venom in her words was unmistakable. Thomas tried to recover, but the damage was done. Their conversation spiraled into accusations and defensiveness, each trying to assert control over a situation that was rapidly slipping away. Evelyn finally stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor as she grabbed her bag and stormed out. I followed her at a distance, letting her anger carry her to the car. She sat behind the wheel for several minutes, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She didn't cry. Evelyn wasn't the type. But I could see the frustration, the helplessness in the way she stared straight ahead. Her jaw clenched as if holding back the scream that wanted to escape. She drove home in silence, her movements robotic as she walked through the door and headed straight for the bedroom. I gave her space, letting her stew in the mess she had created. She didn't come out for the rest of the evening, and I didn't go to her. Instead, I stayed in my office, reviewing the recording of her conversation with Thomas. It was all there, every word, every accusation, every lie. The file was ready to be sent to its intended recipients, the final piece of evidence in a case that would destroy what little she had left. But I didn't send it. Not yet. There was still one more move to make, one more truth to reveal. I waited until the house was dark, the quiet hours when Evelyn's restless movements finally ceased. Then I placed the envelope on her nightstand, a thick, unassuming package filled with every piece of evidence I had gathered. Photos of her and Thomas, transcripts of their conversations, financial records, and a letter that outlined everything she had done in painstaking detail. It wasn't just for her. It was for the world she had tried so hard to keep intact. When she woke the next morning, she would find it there, staring her in the face like a mirror she couldn't avoid. And when she opened it, when she saw the full scope of what I knew, she would understand that this was no longer her story to control. It was mine. The next morning came like the calm before a storm. Evelyn was always the first awake. Her usual routine, a quiet ritual of slipping out of bed, brushing her hair, and preparing coffee before the rest of the house stirred. But today, I stayed awake, feigning sleep, waiting for her reaction. The envelope sat on her nightstand, an unassuming package that held the weight of her world inside it. I heard the soft rustle as she noticed it, her movements slowing. A pause. Then the sound of the clasp being undone. She didn't move for what felt like an eternity, the weight of what she was holding settling over her. The first page was a simple note. You know what this is. Read it all. I didn't need to see her face to imagine her expression. Shock, confusion, maybe fear. Then, as she flipped through the pages, the realization would set in. Every secret laid bare, every lie exposed. The photos, the transcripts, the damning timeline of her betrayal. I had crafted it carefully, detailing not just what she had done but how methodical she had been about it. There was no room for denial, no gaps to exploit. Her breathing grew shallow as she reached the final pages, where I had written a personal message. This is who you are now. This is what you chose. There is no coming back from this. I listened as the papers were shuffled back into the envelope. Then came the sound of her chair being dragged across the room, the slight creak as she sat down heavily. I waited, my heart pounding despite myself. I hadn't anticipated feeling anything other than satisfaction, but there was something more, something raw and unsettling, in knowing she was confronting the truth. I gave her time, enough for the full weight of the revelation to sink in. When I finally entered the room, she was still sitting there, staring blankly at the envelope in her lap. Her face was pale, her eyes distant. She looked up at me as I approached, her expression a mixture of shock and despair. For a brief moment, there was no pretense, no mask. Just the raw vulnerability of someone who had been caught and knew there was no escape. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. I didn't say anything either, letting the silence stretch between us. It wasn't my turn to talk. This was her moment to face what she had done, to try and make sense of the mess she had created. Instead, she lowered her gaze, her fingers gripping the edge of the envelope so tightly that the paper crumpled beneath her hands. I watched as her composure cracked further, her breaths coming in short, uneven gasps. She wasn't crying, Evelyn never cried, but the weight of her emotions was palpable. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. How long have you known? I didn't answer. The question didn't matter. The answers were in front of her, written in black and white. What mattered was what she did next, how she tried to salvage the remnants of the life she had destroyed. If she even could. She stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. Without looking at me, she stormed out of the room, the envelope clutched tightly to her chest like a shield. I didn't follow. I stayed where I was, listening as her footsteps echoed through the house, pacing back and forth, the sound of drawers opening and slamming shut. It wasn't long before I heard the familiar beep of her phone. She was calling someone, probably Thomas. It would be his name she reached for in this moment of desperation, the one she had clung to in her weakest moments. But I had already anticipated this, and the moment her call connected, I intercepted it. Thomas's voice crackled through the speaker in my office, uncertain and tired. Evelyn, is everything okay? Her response was frantic, her words spilling out in a torrent of anger and fear. She accused him of setting her up, of being careless, of dragging her into a mess she could no longer control. She demanded to know if he had been the one to leave the envelope, if this was his way of getting back at her for the cafe confrontation. Thomas tried to calm her, his tone a mixture of confusion and irritation. He denied everything, insisted he had nothing to do with it, that he was just as blindsided as she was. The tension in his voice was clear. He was already cracking under the pressure I had placed on him, and now Evelyn was adding to his burden. Their conversation escalated quickly, devolving into accusations and defensiveness. Evelyn's voice broke at one point, a sharp crack of desperation that caught even Thomas off guard. She wasn't used to being on the back foot, and it showed. She was unraveling faster than I had anticipated, her carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of her guilt. When the call ended, Evelyn returned to the bedroom, her steps slower now, her shoulders hunched. She didn't look at me as she entered, didn't acknowledge my presence. Instead, she sat on the edge of the bed, the envelope still clutched in her hands, and stared at the floor. I let the silence linger before finally speaking, my voice calm but firm. You've lost, Evelyn. The life you had, the lies you told, it's all gone now. There's nothing left to hide. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide and filled with something I hadn't seen before. Fear. She opened her mouth to respond, but I didn't give her the chance. Now, you have to decide what comes next. And so do I. Her silence was deafening. The next few days were a study in quiet devastation. Evelyn moved through the house like a ghost, her usual grace replaced by a stiffness that made her seem smaller, diminished. The envelope rarely left her side, as though holding it might somehow keep the consequences at bay. She barely ate, barely slept, and avoided me altogether, retreating into herself in a way I had never seen before. I watched her from a distance, not out of pity, but to ensure she didn't try to escape what was coming. She had made her choices, and now she would live with the aftermath. It was no longer about her, or even about us. It was about closure. For me, for the years I had spent building a life that she had so carelessly torn apart. Her phone remained silent. Thomas hadn't contacted her since their explosive conversation, and I doubted he would. He was too preoccupied with the fallout from the corporate investigation, the whispers of his unethical practices growing louder with each passing day. He was unraveling in his own way, and Evelyn's implosion was likely the last thing he wanted to deal with. She was alone now, truly and utterly alone. It was a Saturday afternoon when she finally cracked. I was sitting in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee, when she appeared in the doorway. Her face was pale, her eyes bloodshot, and her hands trembled as she gripped the envelope. She stood there for a moment, as if gathering the courage to speak, before stepping forward and placing the envelope on the table in front of me. Her voice was barely audible. "What do you want from me?" I stared at her for a long moment, letting the weight of her question settle between us. What did I want? The answer was complicated. Part of me wanted her to suffer, to feel the depth of the betrayal she had inflicted. Another part of me wanted her gone, erased from my life entirely. But most of all, I wanted her to understand, to fully grasp the magnitude of her choices and the destruction they had caused. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I reached for the envelope, flipping it open and pulling out the letter I had written. I slid it across the table toward her, watching as her eyes flicked downward to the words she had already read. She didn't move, didn't reach for it. She just stood there, her breathing shallow, her expression unreadable. Finally, I spoke, my tone cold and deliberate. "This isn't about what I want, Evelyn. It's about what you've done. You've lied, betrayed, and destroyed everything we built together. And now, you have to face it." She flinched at my words, her shoulders sagging as though the weight of them physically pressed down on her. But she didn't argue, didn't deny. That, more than anything, told me how far she had fallen. The woman who had once been so confident, so defiant, was now a hollow version of herself. I stood, towering over her as I leaned forward on the table. "You've lost the right to ask what I want. The only question left is what you're going to do now." She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the letter as though it might offer some kind of escape. But there was none. She knew that as well as I did. The next morning, Evelyn packed a suitcase. She didn't say where she was going, and I didn't ask. I watched as she moved through the house, her steps heavy, her movements mechanical. She avoided my gaze, her face set in a mask of resignation. When she finally walked out the door, I felt a strange mix of relief and emptiness. The house felt quieter without her, but it was a different kind of quiet. Less oppressive, more freeing. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to exhale, to let the tension that had gripped me for so long begin to fade. It wasn't over, not entirely, but it was a step forward. Evelyn was gone, and I was left to rebuild what she had broken. Her departure didn't erase the damage, of course. The memories, the betrayal, they still lingered, a constant presence in the back of my mind. But I had something she no longer did. Control. Over my life, my choices, my future. And that, I realized, was enough. For now. Evelyn's absence left a void, but not the kind I'd expected. It wasn't sorrow or regret that filled the empty spaces she left behind. It was clarity. The silence in the house, once heavy with tension, now felt like an opportunity to reclaim the life I had almost forgotten I deserved. For years, I had been navigating a partnership built on lies, blind to how much of myself I had sacrificed for the illusion of stability. With her gone, I turned my attention to the remnants of my life, piecing together the fragments with the same precision I had once reserved for my work. Her belongings, still scattered throughout the house, were methodically packed into boxes. I didn't rush the process. Every item, every photograph, every small token of a life we had shared was another reminder of the deception she had buried beneath it. One evening, as I was sorting through a drawer in the bedroom, I came across an old photo of us from a vacation years ago. We were smiling, arms wrapped around each other, standing on a windswept beach. It was the kind of photo you'd frame, the kind that tells the story of a happy couple at first glance. But now, I looked at it differently. The smile seemed forced, the embrace hollow. Had she already been lying to me back then? Had I been too blinded by love to see it? I didn't linger on the question. I slipped the photo into a box with the others and sealed it shut. The past, as vivid and painful as it was, no longer held power over me. What mattered was what came next. The weeks that followed were a mix of catharsis and quiet revenge. Evelyn's absence didn't mean the end of her consequences. The envelope I had left for her was only the beginning. I had sent similar packages to key people in her life. Friends, colleagues, even her parents. They didn't contain the full scope of her betrayal, just enough to ensure that her carefully constructed image began to crack in places she couldn't control. Her parents were the first to reach out. They called me late one evening, their voices heavy with concern. They hadn't spoken to Evelyn since she left, and the details I had shared in my letter had left them stunned. Her mother, a reserved woman who rarely showed emotion, broke down on the phone, apologizing profusely for what her daughter had done. Her father, always the more stoic of the two, simply asked if there was anything they could do to make things right. I told them the truth. There was nothing to fix. Evelyn had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. They didn't argue, didn't try to defend her. Instead, they thanked me for my honesty and promised to hold her accountable if she ever reached out to them. Her friends, on the other hand, were a different story. Most of them sided with her initially, accusing me of being vindictive, of airing dirty laundry that should have remained private. But as the weeks went on and more pieces of the story came to light, their loyalty wavered. I began hearing whispers from mutual acquaintances, stories of friends distancing themselves from her, questioning her version of events. Evelyn, it seemed, was learning what it felt like to be truly alone. I kept tabs on her, not out of lingering affection, but to ensure the plan I had set in motion was working. She hadn't contacted Thomas since their fight, and his downfall was well underway. He had been officially terminated from his position, and his name was circulating in legal circles as the subject of an impending lawsuit. The younger woman he had been seeing had moved on, cutting ties with him completely. His world, like Evelyn's, was in ruins. Despite the satisfaction I felt watching their lives crumble, there was a surprising lack of bitterness in my heart. The anger that had driven me for so long was beginning to fade, replaced by a sense of closure. They had both paid for their betrayal, and while the scars they left behind would never fully heal, I no longer felt the need to dwell on them. Instead, I turned my focus inward. The house, once a reminder of the life Evelyn and I had built together, was slowly transforming into something new. I repainted the walls, rearranged the furniture, and got rid of anything that felt tied to her. It wasn't just about reclaiming the space, it was about reclaiming myself. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to think about the future. Not as a husband, not as the victim of betrayal, but as a man standing at the edge of a new chapter. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, that uncertainty didn't scare me. It felt liberating. Evelyn's final gift to me, unintended though it was, had been the reminder of my own strength. I had survived her lies, her betrayal, and the collapse of the life I thought I wanted. Now, I had the chance to rebuild, not just my home but myself. And this time, I would do it on my terms.